Do Americans eat too much protein? A recent article might surprise you if you're in the health and fitness industry and you're frequently telling clients, hey, you need to eat more protein. We actually have a recent Vox article that came out that's been making its rounds in the health and fitness industry, and it's leading to a lot of questions because it's actually saying that Americans eat too much protein. And how dangerous can this be, especially if it comes from animal products? Now, we know a lot of times news headlines can be taken out of context, or it's basically using studies and maybe misinterpreting information from that study, or not necessarily looking at all the methods and results from that particular study. So let's dive into this headline and unpack what it actually means when it comes to our health and fitness.
What's up and welcome to Sam Miller Science, where you're joining me just over a decade into my personal journey of working to bridge the gap between metabolism, macros, muscle, and medicine, all while helping coaches scale the impact that they desire and deserve. If you are here, thank you so much for listening and for trusting me to help you elevate your coaching game or to lead you in your transformation to realize your true potential. In either case, each week I'll be sharing my methods, models, and message to serve as leverage for your specific goals. Without further ado, let's get on to today's show.
This particular article is significantly more dangerous than it may appear when it comes to public health information. Now, simply telling people to make modifications to their macronutrients may not seem too crazy on the surface, but the problem is, protein, as we have more and more research coming out, we realize just how paramount protein is when it comes to overall longevity and performance. Now, we're going to be going over three major claims from the article today and why it can be problematic for the everyday individual or anyone who has significant health and fitness goals. And each one of these claims I'm going to debunk one by one and talk about the importance of protein and why we should probably throw away this article and tell everyone the truth when it comes to our protein intake. Now, in this article, it's clearly written by those who are currently favoring the overall kind of social media message around veganism and plant-based eating. Now, there is more of a societal push towards these foods, and we have to understand where that's coming from and why it can potentially be harmful depending on our goals. Veganism can work for some people. This video is not designed by any means to attack anyone who decides to pursue a plant-based eating style, but just because people do pursue a plant-based eating style doesn't mean we need to be demonizing protein. So this is my attempt to kind of bring the focus back towards adequate protein intake. So it has to be very well planned to be successful. Something that gets lost a lot of times is if you are going to be vegetarian or vegan, and I've talked about this on the channel before, so I don't want to belabor the point, is we need to make sure we are getting a full spectrum of essential amino acids. We need to make sure we're getting adequate protein and essential amino acid intake, which is a lot harder to do on a vegan diet, especially getting things like leucine and making sure we have that complementary array of essential amino acids. And it takes a lot of nutritional knowledge and information about micronutrient status to be successful with plant-based eating. And I don't just mean successful in terms of weight loss, and I don't just mean successful in terms of eating a bunch of fruits and vegetables, but also making sure that we do have well-rounded micronutrient intake, because we know we have evidence to support the fact, and I've seen this anecdotally play out quite a bit as well outside of the research, is it's going to predispose us for B12, folate, iron, zinc, and certain omega-3 deficiencies. So let's address these claims and kind of dive into why we don't necessarily just want to fall victim to this Vox article, and we need to pay attention when it comes to our nutrition. The first claim is Americans are eating almost twice as much protein as the current recommendations suggest, and they simply don't need to do this. Well, let's unpack what those current recommendations are and if maybe those recommendations need to be adjusted. First of all, the current recommendations are in place to prevent protein deficiency, not to obtain optimal protein status or protein intake, or to have all of the essential amino acids we need. They aren't necessarily set to be optimal. So for numbers, it's currently recommended that individuals get 0.36 grams per pound of body weight. So for a 130-pound woman, this would be about 47 grams of protein per day. You can obviously do the math if you want to carry this over to a 200-pound male or a 150-pound individual or a 250-pound individual. Either way, it is not really a lot of protein, especially when you start to look at active and training populations. This is going to put us a little bit short. Then we have to think about all of the hyperpalatable foods in our environment and the fact that protein is one of the most satiating nutrients and really helps with managing appetite and blood sugar stability. We really have to start to think, okay, maybe this 0.36 grams isn't really getting us where we need to be. There's an enormous body of high protein diet literature, and even amongst sedentary individuals. So I'm not just saying, hey, these are people hitting the weights. These are people who are resistance training or athletes. Even if you are not an athlete, We see better inflammatory markers with increased protein intake, better body composition outcomes, and greater fat loss. We also see better insulin sensitivity and much, much more from a metabolic health perspective. In fact, a new review study from 2023 titled, "Is it time to reconsider the US recommendations for dietary protein and amino acid intake?" discussed the fact that the current dietary recommendations aren't even enough to prevent deficiency, let alone enough for optimal benefits from protein as a key macronutrient. The next claim I want to address is the fact that in this Vox article, they flat out say excessive protein consumption, especially from cholesterol-rich animal-based foods, is correlated with increased risk of cancer and heart disease. First off, even the American Heart Association updated its stance in 2019 that dietary cholesterol does not play into heart disease. So the AHA, first getting involved in this conversation, obviously because it's an association geared towards cardiovascular disease prevention. Second, the claim is that high animal protein diets increase the risk of heart disease and cancer. This has been debunked over and over and over again when we actually look at the research. If you want a deeper dive on this topic, I would suggest listening in the audio feed. So on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, there's hundreds of episodes of my podcast, Sam Miller Science, and 346 goes into a lot of the myths around red meat consumption. So if you're someone who's on the fence about that, or you're looking for more education, or you are someone who does eat lean animal proteins, or you're a fan of ruminant meats, definitely check out episode 346 to learn about some of the benefits from red meat. And this would include things not only just beef, but also bison, elk, venison, etc. So really any ruminant meats, we can potentially get those benefits. Now 346 is also debunking a lot of the claims that we see on social media around that. Now in a nutshell, most of the epidemiological data and studies suffer from what's called as healthy user bias. When we look at better controlled studies, what we actually find, so for example, a 2023 from the study included over 500,000 people, showed that high protein diets do not increase the risk of cardiovascular disease compared to normal protein diets. In fact, even in terms of cancer, a 2020 review with over 50,000 individuals, now we're talking about a lot of humans, this is not a small sample size, 50,000 for this one in terms of cancer risk, 500,000 in terms of cardiovascular disease, and in the study of 50,000 individuals, what we saw is there was no increased risk of cancer from animal protein consumption. Remember, your quality of your protein is going to matter too. This is the difference between someone who's going and eating single ingredient food like steak or grass-fed beef versus someone, there's a difference between ground beef and someone who's having a very, very low quality style of animal protein and potentially something that has a lot of ingredients in it or much higher fat content relative to protein content. So the overall intake matters here and paying attention to those details. But even these studies, just looking at animal protein in general, support the notion that increasing your animal protein intake can be a good thing depending on your situation. We also have two 2023 papers from cancer experts saying if someone does have cancer, the majority of their protein intake should actually come from animal products because muscle wasting is a huge potential issue when it comes to cancer. So when we look at overall longevity in the conversation, not just cancer, but also sarcopenia, osteoporosis, and osteopenia, and overall frailty with age, animal protein is paramount at preventing muscle protein wasting, and that's because of the essential amino acid intake and having the ability to trigger muscle protein synthesis when we're eating adequate amounts of lean animal protein. So when we look at animal products, they do have greater anabolic potential, largely due to the amino acid profile. In addition, the other paper found that animal protein intake does not cause tumors to grow faster, which was previous hypothesis in the cancer space. Finally, so last but not least here, but two of the largest risk factors for cancer development are obesity and poor metabolic health or insulin resistance. These two things can be combated effectively with a high protein diet because protein is going to help to manage appetite. It also helps to support building lean muscle tissue. So having, protein in play here could actually be not only a preventive measure overall, but it could also be very proactive in the sense that we are able to, combat muscle wasting, we're able to combat poor metabolic health, and potentially when we combine protein with other macronutrients, regulating that blood glucose meal to meal as well, and just serving as a great satiety tool. I talk about it in my book, Metabolism Made Simple. So if you haven't checked that out, I talk about the 5 M's of managing metabolism. One of those is maximizing adherence. The other one is managing our appetite. Protein is a great tool for both managing appetite and maximizing adherence because no one's ever been successful on a diet if they're constantly feeling like a hungry hippo all the time. If you remember like the childhood board game where you have your hungry hippos, protein is your tool to help leverage that from a satiety perspective, but also the fact that it's great for muscle recovery and preventing muscle wasting. The last claim I want to address is the fact that they say meat and dairy products make up 1/5 of all greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore we're wrecking the planet if we eat a high protein diet. I did address the environmental concerns in episode 346 in the audio feed if you want a complete deep dive. But since it's been a couple years since I did that episode, I do want to provide some updated figures that may be important if you're not as familiar with the data. The EPA website shows that greenhouse gas emissions from all agriculture, crops and livestock included, was 10% of total emissions in 2021. Breaking that down further, they say livestock production accounts for about 3% of that, which is a far cry from the 1/5 that they talk about in the article. So let's shift gears and talk about why this information might actually be dangerous. The obvious point is that obesity is really, first and foremost, I think one of the primary issues that's going on in the United States, just in America and the Western world as a whole, and anywhere where there's a Western style of eating or what people would consider to be the standard American diet. So looking at hyperpalatable, high-calorie foods that lead people to very easily overeat, and we're in a state of basically overconsumption, but under nutrition from like a nourishment and micronutrient protein perspective. So looking at this enormous issue of obesity in the United States, we have so many studies showing how beneficial high-protein diets can be for this particular problem. If a random general population person or someone who's just reading this Vox article were to encounter this, I think about family members who have less experience in the health and fitness space, they'll probably start to reduce their protein intake. But where do they go from there, right? They're already not necessarily eating a lot of single ingredient animal foods. So in the real world where ultra processed fast food is super cheap, or packaged, think about packaged foods with multiple ingredients. I'm not saying processed. Some people in the nutrition space are like, well, oatmeal's processed because it's grain that's rolled out into, whatever, or saying that even to have rice be, what it ends up being on your table that is processed. I'm talking about packaged foods with a lot of ingredients, different flavorings and things that are leading to drive that overconsumption because they're so palatable and they're also very calorically dense relative to the micronutrients they provide. So, when we think about, okay, these people are reducing their protein intake, or the Vox article says Americans are over consuming protein, well, people are still going to eat. So what are you going to replace that intake with, especially given that protein's a lot more filling? So now all of a sudden, okay, how are we backfilling those calories? Because most people aren't just going to cut their protein intake down and not eat. They're going to eat something. So there's going to be a substitute. Now, is it going to be a healthy one? Probably not, given the state of this article and the lay of the land in the nutrition space. So in most cases, it's not going to be equally viable sources of protein, and it's probably not going to be, oh, this person went and ate like an apple or something instead, right? Or blueberries. A lot of times people are replacing, when they see articles like this, they kind of have, they kind of throw their hands up and they're frustrated because there's so much conflicting nutrition information. And I would say a lot of people have such confusion around either where to start, or they're hearing that animal protein is bad, and so they're just replacing that with just carbohydrates and other things. And they're not single ingredient carbohydrates either. Usually it's just more of the same if they're already eating a lot of packaged foods or processed foods or fast food. So here's a striking statistic. The chance that an individual will be dead within a year if they break a hip after the age of 65 is roughly 30%. That's scary, and that's huge. It also shows how important it is to have muscle, but also the ability to, do things like being able to brace your fall, or being able to catch yourself, or being able to have some stability and mobility and strength. So while exercise and micronutrients matter here as well, a high protein diet is a foundational cornerstone that protects against osteoporosis and sarcopenia. That statistic is incredibly alarming, especially I'm someone who has older relatives and family members, and I know that not necessarily everyone is eating the same amount of protein when it comes to getting that adequate intake. And so seeing articles like this, knowing that they're not necessarily people who follow like nutrition and fitness YouTube accounts or listen to podcasts that are on the science of protein intake, that's concerning to me, right? And a lot of you guys who are health and fitness professionals or nutrition coaches or dietitians or physicians or nurses who are working with people in the real world, you're seeing people who are not necessarily in a place that have optimal dietary intake of these nutrients, and it's going to play out over the course of several decades. Now, that statistic around breaking a hip is incredibly scary and just shows more reason for, resistance training, building skeletal muscle, and having adequate protein intake. So as we wrap up today in this episode for both the audio feed and the video, if you're watching on YouTube, remember these major points. The epidemiological studies that are often referenced, especially when it comes to veganism and plant-based eating, fail to properly adjust for what's called the healthy user bias, basically meaning if they're people who aren't sedentary, or they're people who aren't smoking, or they're not drinking, right? We've seen that with some of the research and epidemiological data that comes from the Seventh-day Adventist community. And when you have a population that's not smoking, not drinking, and they are active or exercising, those are things that are automatically going to skew in the direction of healthier, it's going to report information and data that then appears to kind of confound some of the outcomes that we're looking at. If we look at even epidemiology that adjusts properly, or look solely at health conscious meat eaters instead of just meat eaters who are maybe viewing meat eating as like hot dogs, people who get enough fiber, antioxidants, and polyphenols, we can adjust that and see significant benefits to health, including fat loss, muscle gain, lower inflammatory markers, better insulin sensitivity, and much, much more. I know sometimes it can be confusing out there with all the different nutrition articles that pop up, different social media posts, and things that you'll even see on TV, depending on what you're watching and consuming. And so sometimes, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse with this information and sharing over and over again how, we don't need to be afraid of omnivorous eating right now, but because of these articles, it's often necessary to debunk some of these extreme claims and provide data on what's going on from a longevity perspective, cancer risk, cardiovascular disease risk, metabolic health, and citing those important statistics around having muscle and being cognizant of muscle wasting, overall sarcopenia, osteopenia, and osteoporosis, because over the age of 60, over the age of 65, these become really, really big issues. If you're someone who's interested in learning more just about managing appetite and maximizing overall metabolic health, a great starter tool is going to be my book, Metabolism Made Simple. You can learn more about that at metabolismmadesimple.com, and it's often linked either in show notes or below videos. You can also find it on my website, sammillerscience.com. But if you're someone who is a health and fitness professional, you focus a lot on nutrition with your clients, you're looking to better understand some of these things like inflammatory markers, you're looking to better understand things related to nutrition intake in both intermediate to advanced concept, not just macros, but you want to understand micronutrients, essential amino acids, you understand the impact when it comes to insulin sensitivity and cardiovascular disease risk, understanding how all of this ties together, choosing the right eating style for the person, even for intermediate to advanced, sometimes complex cases, you're going to want to check out my nutrition and metabolism specialization program for coaches. You can learn more about that at metabolismschool.com. Now, in this episode today, covered a lot in terms of animal-based eating, the current dietary recommendations, potentially undershooting what people actually need, and the benefits of protein for both lean muscle mass, and even considering this from a longevity angle as well. If you think someone would benefit from this, whether they're someone who follows your content, maybe they're just a friend or family member, or it's someone that you coach personally, grab the link for wherever you're listening and share the show. This is your way to kind of pay it forward. This episode was pretty much straight into the research, straight into the article, and also providing some experience from a coaching perspective that I think can help you or people that you care about. So rather than filling your feed with ads, all that I ask is you pay it forward and share the show, or leave a rating and review wherever you're listening. So if you're on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, you have the ability to drop that rating, or quick review takes less than 10 seconds. If you're on YouTube, give it a thumbs up and comment. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a show. And this allows me to continue to provide more no-cost information like this related to nutrition, health optimization, longevity, performance, and just the latest overall, supplementation and nutrition topics that can really go a long way in supporting you in your fitness, performance, longevity journey, or towards your aesthetic goals as well. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I'm glad you guys tuned in, and I appreciate you listening to me, and I will talk to you in the next show.